Welcome back to Chop for Time. Britt is gone; he's back to work, so you're stuck with me for today. But we are back. We're going to be talking about our last week in the series of Joseph, week 8. What was the name of the title again?
So close.
Week 7.
So close. Week 7, and not the last week.
Oh,
we added an additional one.
See, this is why they don't put me in this chair. Usually, I'm just running the cameras. But anyway. All right, so Ben, do you want to give us a bit of a recap as to what we talked about yesterday?
Yeah, we talked about the source of life was the passage, was the title of the message. The passage we primarily stayed in chapter 46. We did talk about chapter 48 just briefly, but those, the focus of yesterday was really when the brothers got sent back to Jacob, their father, with the revelation that Joseph was alive and that Joseph wanted him, his house, everything on the edict and the command of Pharaoh to bring the entirety of his family and his household into Egypt, which on the surface is an incredible thing because you're in the place where you're facing a drought. You've got a famine. You've already had to go twice for food to Egypt to, buy, sell, whatever you could to try to get grain, because the famine has just debilitated an entire region at this point. So on the surface, what seems like something that is really, really kind of easy and a no-brainer may not have been that simple, especially to Jacob, to Israel. And that's what we spent some time looking at, is that this was an incredible step of faith that he had to take. So there was a source of life that was available to him and his family and the entirety of his livelihood in Egypt. But that would mean that he would be stepping away from where he was. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we spent quite a bit of time on yesterday was this realization that Jacob was dwelling in the promised land, that area that had been promised to Abraham, his grandfather, that his people and his descendants would possess this promised land that came from God, that was set apart solely for them. Jacob had arrived there. He had spent the entirety of his life in other areas trying to make it to this place, and he had arrived. He had settled. He had built his family there. He had livestock. I mean, he was where he had lined his entire life up to be. And now he's being asked to go somewhere else, to leave the place of promise that God had for him. Verse 1 begins out of chapter 46, 1 through 4 we read yesterday, was where the first place that they went once they left Canaan was Beersheba. That was the place that Abraham had bought from King Absalom for 7 ewes, for 7 lambs, and that was one of the initial places that he had encountered the place of God, also during a drought, during a famine. Isaac, which was Jacob's father, had encountered God there as well, and that's where he went, and it said he worshiped the Lord. Just went back to this place because this was an incredible step of faith for him, because he's leaving the place of promise to go into a pagan land. And I think that that's something that had been lost on me in the entirety of this story for all the years that I had studied Joseph, was this incredible ask of someone to leave the place that they've spent their entire life trying to get to. And then will they be willing to follow the Lord? Because God came to him in a dream, came to Jacob in a dream while he was there at Beersheba and said, "This is the Lord, the God of your father. Go to Egypt. I will go with you." So we took that and just really laid that story out, and then looked at 4 elements of faith that is approved by God. And we went to Hebrews chapter 11, looked at 4 areas we saw in there where faith that's approved by God believes that he will prevail. that God will prevail. It believes that he will never fail. It also is, it maintains. It's still there even in times of suffering. And faith that pleases God is also faith that we remain that way even if we don't experience his promises in this life. And that's really kind of the overall synopsis of the message yesterday.
Well, cool. Yeah, we're really blessed to have Christy Dyer with us here today. She's joined us for the conversation, and so I might throw it over to you. What your main takeaway for the sermon was for this week?
Yeah, I really can't believe that I had never even thought about the fact that he was already in the Promised Land, and then ended up going to Egypt, and it makes me think of the verse that says that a man can plan his steps, but it is the Lord that determines his path. Mm-hmm. Why in the world did he have them end up in Egypt and then, later with Moses back to the Promised Land? But, it's God who's in control. And, there's so many things that happened while they were in Egypt, during that time. And then the whole process of getting back to the Promised Land, there's so much that they learn from that and that we learn from that. So we have to trust his plan. So I just cannot believe that. I had never even thought of that before, that they were already there in the Promised Land, but they had to go through this. They had to go through this thing. And before they ended up back there. And it's the same for us. We have to go through these things.
When we took a look at Genesis 15, kind of in passing yesterday, and Genesis 15 is one of the initial promises that God makes to Abram when he's talking about your descendants will be, as numerous as the stars in the sky. Mm-hmm. He takes a moment, 2 verses out of Genesis 15, where he says, "But there's coming a time where your people, your descendants, will be held in captivity for 400 years. He says, but don't worry, there will be a great destitution or a great plague come against that nation that puts you into bondage. So this is God, another puzzle piece falling into place hundreds of years later that God has already talked to him about. It's like, listen, I'm going to do all of this. You're going to be here. Then you're going to go, then this is going to happen. For the exact amount of years that the Israelites were in Egyptian bondage.
Yeah, so
but then
specific.
They will be led out, and that nation's basically going to fund your travel back to this area. But yeah, it was just, I wonder with things like that, because this is Jacob's grandfather, that this promise was initially made to, and I kind of wonder if that had made its way down through, like Grandpa used to say, where it's like, if Abraham had passed that along to Isaac, and Isaac would have passed that along to Jacob, of like, this is the promise, but there was this little caveat thrown in here. And almost have to wonder if there was some recognition of this. I don't know if I would have done that. Even if I'd heard my father and grandfather talk about that, I'd have been like, but I'm here. Why am I leaving? So.
Yeah, one of the things we sort of talked about with the middle schoolers was like the scale of this move was not just like, you're living in grace and God calls you to green up. It's like this is like, we get that big long list in that second half of chapter 46 of like loads of names,
the genealogy.
And like, and there's 66 other children that they had, or, and we were kind of like, this is like first church, the whole church being called to move to like Africa by today's society, because travel is so much more readily available, but to move across to a different nation because God calls us to, because it's better. It's like it's not just like one person getting up and going, which happens relatively frequently, but Jacob brings everybody. Yeah. It's a huge.
You talk about logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
Wow.
I sort of jokingly sort of asked like. Who here loves Grayson? Every hand shoots up, because there's a good little close-knit community here that, people are very proud of and happy to be a part of. And, we sort of said, like, how would you feel if one day you just were called to move to the West Coast, or move to Chicago, to somewhere maybe potentially more dangerous where you're not as welcome, or, things like that. And they were all kind of like, oh, I don't know. But it was kind of cool because just, I had Daniel down there with me. His family's just moved to Poland for missions work, so he's dealing with his family's now left, and I've left my family and moved here, and we were just sort of saying like, kind of this stuff still happens, so brace yourselves because it could happen to you. Yeah. God may call you to stay in grace in your whole life, or he might call you to Poland like he did with Daniel's family, and so it was a kind of cool little eye-opening thing of like, these sort of really old Bible stories still have application today. Like if God calls you and gives you, has this promise. One of the things I love about it was he gives the same promise to Jacob that he gave to Abraham. Mm-hmm. I am God, the God of your father. He said, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. He still has that same tagline of like, oh wait, that's the tagline for our family, isn't it? We'll be made into a great nation. God says we're going to do it in Egypt now. So time to go to Egypt,
Another analogy with that, we talked a lot yesterday with the high school kids about back to school. And so we kind of talked about their goals for the school year. And one thing that kept coming up was they were like, this summer I've spent time with all my church friends. And now I'm about to be thrown back into school where I'll be surrounded by unbelievers. And a lot of the kids were like, I don't want to fall back into that rough friend group that I was with last year. And, that kind of thing. They're going back into an environment where they're not going to be surrounded by people that think and believe like them. And that was the case with Jacob and them too. Like that would have been terrifying to take your whole family and go to Egypt, especially when you're in such a desperate situation, like they were about to starve. And so they were going to be very dependent on this, pagan nation that did not share their beliefs or anything. And so it had to be terrifying. But yeah, it made me think of that analogy with the kids yesterday as they go back to school and are surrounded by people who don't think like them and may not even be nice to them sometimes.
Yeah. Well, our key takeaway yesterday was that God is always moving. He's always working and always desiring to, I forgot the exact word, but God is always working for the blessings of his people. He's always doing things that's inevitably and at the end going to be a blessing to us. And, I acknowledge the fact of like, listen, on the surface, we all kind of go, yeah, that's right. But then I threw in two key factors. I said, but once we get below that surface of knowing that this is a good Sunday school biblical truth right here, once you get below that and start looking at the practical aspects of your life and some of the things that are going on there, it becomes a little bit more difficult to process that and truly just, attaboy on that one, because what if the situations or the things that he's working in the midst of aren't pleasant, because we all find ourselves in those hurtful and painful situations. And very rarely do we look and go, oh, this is a blessing from God. So two of the key factors that I said that had to kind of quantify that as a key takeaway was, number one, that God is faithful always, that he's a faithful God. And the second key factor was that if God is always faithful, then we must be faith-filled. Because he's faithful, we must be faith-filled. And that I'd be interested to hear y'all's thoughts or kind of what went through your head as you were reading that, hearing that yesterday. Christy?
Yeah. Well, I liked, you touched a lot on suffering yesterday. Mm-hmm. And gosh, I just felt that was so applicable to our lives. And I loved what you said about how thankful we should be that we're on this side of the timeline of Jesus, because we know they were still, looking forward, anticipating, and but endured a lot of suffering. Mm-hmm. I think it's a little easier for us because we see the bigger picture. Christ came, he suffered, he died for us, and we're going to have trouble in this life, but we're going to be good in the next. And so, but still, like you said, just in the middle of, we all have suffering. But in the middle of it, we know that he is faithful, that he is, Romans 8:28, he is working it out for our good. And we know that he will do that, especially us older people, because we've seen him do it so many times before in our life. But it's still really hard to remain faithful ourselves in the midst of that suffering. We know and we can trust that he is faithful because he's proven himself, but it is a different story for us to remain faithful in those times of suffering.
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen happen a lot with young people is, or maybe it's just like a 90s style Sunday school teaching, is you just have to have blind faith. Be faith-filled, but it's blind faith. Walk by faith, not by sight. So then they're like, well, blind faith. And it's like, I don't know. I'm starting to change. I don't think that's actually always correct. I think there are times where it's like, you know what, you're going to be walking into something and you don't know what it's going to be. Have faith. But I think there's other times where it's like, that's why we have all these stories, is because we have all of this history of God proving himself over and over and over again for especially for younger people. I'll lump myself in there for today. That maybe don't have a big life experience of seeing God doing it over and over again. That's why we have all these other examples of that's why, even the Jews today still look back at the Exodus and they cling to that as like this big moment of their history. And it's kind of sad that we don't as much, we look back to Jesus, which absolutely we should, but there's a whole other big chunk of story there that we can continue to see. God has been faithful over and over and over again. So even when you face your first big hurdle, you don't have to have blind faith because you've seen him do it through all of human history. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of times we're just like, well, I'm just, let go and let God, which is good, but sometimes we can take that and use it in a negative way of like, I don't even need to think or read or study or learn. I'm just going to say, yep, there's a God, and I'm going to just live my life in the way that I want to. I'm worried that we sometimes go that way, as opposed to like, no, the reason we have all of this stuff is to prove God's done this over and over and over again. So when I have a bad day, I know I'm going to be fine because Joseph got thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, put in prison for many years, forgotten about, far worse than anything that I'm probably ever going to face in my entire life. And he had faith coming out the other side, and it was all worth it. So yeah, that makes sense.
That's a really good point. I think a lot of people these days say, oh, well, the Old Testament isn't applicable, but it 100% is.
Yeah, there was a moment yesterday where I could almost tangibly feel the air go out of the room. And there's not in necessarily a bad way. And there's been a couple times that I can remember that over the past handful of years. One was when I shared a John Piper quote, and then we kind of articulated a little bit deeper on that. It was basically, his quote at that point was, if Jesus were not in heaven, would you still want to go? Would you still want to be there if Jesus weren't there? And it kind of challenged our motives as to why we're looking forward to heaven and what our ultimate goal is and what our ultimate prize and treasure is. Yesterday, I felt that same kind of moment happen with the last part of challenging if we were truly faith-filled or not, and that the faith that's approved by God and are we going to continue to be faith-filled, live a faith-filled life and faithful to God, even if the promises don't happen during this life. And that was just one that you could feel landed with weight, which it should, because I believe that reveals to us our motives as to why we're truly following Christ. Because if we're okay with that, and if we're saying, yeah, my faith is not going to be shaken regardless of what I experience here on earth, then we probably have a pretty good focus on what this Christian life and following Jesus is really all about. Because the ultimate promise, the greatest promise, none of us are ever going to experience here on this earth during this life, because it's the promise of eternal life with him in heaven. And I just, that one challenged me during the week, and I was kind of glad that I felt that happen in the room, because that is a very weighty proposition, so to speak.
And it's one of those ones as well, is like, you never quite know where your faith's at until it's tested. You know what I mean? Like, which is never fun.
Yeah.
It's usually not as good a time. But, often looking back on those sorts of moments, it's actually like, oh, wow, that was, whenever you look back on a time when your faith was being tested and you see God helping you through that time, it's like, wow, that was cool. And getting to sort of cling to those kind of moments. But yeah, I mean, it's always like that question. I mean, I know, those Bible verses that terrify people, especially the I never knew passage is obviously a big one, but it always, those sorts of times, I think that was another sermon that you gave that kind of took the breath out of a lot of people of like, oh, those sorts of things. But it's like, God does call us to have faith, and faith is one of those things that it is really hard to quantify, because we love to quantify things. I think, we love evidence and proof, and, so does the book of James. So, the Bible's not removed from that either, but faith isn't some weird arbitrary like level up system that you get to have. It's like a relationship, and relationships aren't as quantifiable as other things, which just it can be stressful for people who are like, I need to know that I'm hitting these goals and these levels, and Jesus just run after me.
Yeah.
Like that's all I'm asking. Like, we kind of overcomplicate things sometimes,
Christy, your thoughts?
I think about Paul, who of course was on our side of Christ coming, but I think about, all the suffering that he endured, the big long list: shipwrecked, snake bit, persecuted, martyred. I mean, there were so many things that he never saw come to fruition. He was just out there, spreading the gospel, like crazy, but knew that it was going to cost him his life, but it was worth it to him. And he never saw, he saw some, I think he saw some fruits of his labors, but, they were just getting started at that point. Yeah. So there were, and he just discarded all of his own personal wants in his life. And he just, suffered for the spreading of the gospel, which is, I think, really amazing. And then the second thing that it made me think of, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, is, there are going to be things in this life that never come to fruition for us, or there is going to be suffering that goes on for some people all the way to the day that they do die. But salvation that comes from what Jesus did for us is enough. Like, if he never did anything else good for us in our whole life, if we were born and lived a whole life of suffering, but he still went to the cross for us, if that was the only good thing that he ever did for us, it's still way more than enough. Yeah. It's way more than enough. So
It's good.
Promises are one of those weird things, isn't it? It's like and maybe this is just me, but you were talking about it's interesting seeing Jacob actually, his life kind of comes to an end, leaving his promised land, going into hopefully another one. Do you know what I mean? And people talk all the time about these, the promises of God, and it's one of those things where I'm always kind of wondering, like, I don't really know how to word this well, but I feel like there's a lot of times that people have these promises that God has made them that are just their desires. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And sometimes it might be a promise, but it's like, how, I think we've talked about this before, but like discerning the difference between like, this is a desire that I have that God has answered compared to a promise that God has made. Do you know what I mean? Like, right. For us, Kylie and I have always wanted to have a coffee shop. We talked about it before we even dated. We were just like, both of us said we would love to have, individually, we'd love to have a coffee shop down the line, a little hospitable, cool little environment. And now we have one, but I don't know if God ever promised me that.
It's a blessing, not a promise.
Absolutely a blessing. But, a lot of other people, I feel like the word promise is thrown around a lot. Mm-hmm. Whereas with Jacob, it seems so clear.
Yeah.
Obviously in hindsight, but, this promise of a great nation, this promise of the promised land and all that kind of stuff. And that's one of those areas that I always get a little bit confused. Maybe not confused, but worried that we just threw the word promise around far too easily. I don't know if you want to. We only have a few minutes left, but I don't know if you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're onto it, onto something for sure. Just because I think that, how do I want to say this properly? We're so self-driven, and we are part of God's story. He's not part of ours. Yeah, I mean, we're not the center of the universe. History is not going to be recorded as to what God did in our lives. You know, that type of thing. We are brought into his story. Now, we're going to look next week about his plan and that we are valuable to God. We do play a part, and he has plans for us, but we're not the main character.
Right.
And I think that so often we place ourselves as the main character in every story that we can possibly conceive ourselves being in. And that's a pride issue. And we have this struggle that we feel like if God truly cared for us, or truly loved us, that the gospel becomes more about us being satisfied in this life rather than us being transformed in this life. Jesus didn't come to satisfy us. He came to rescue us. Yeah. And each and every one of us stand in that need, in that place. And when we start viewing things apart from Scripture of what we see truly is promised in there, and start taking our desires and our wants, albeit as noble and as morally upright and righteous as they could possibly be, if we start adding those extra biblically and start considering those of like, well, God doesn't keep his promises, or God never, that comes from a me-centered view of things. Yeah. And that's what each and every one of us intrinsically are hardwired to do. And that's the way that we look at things.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important for us to be in the Word, because we need to know what are promises and what are just blessings. And, there are some very clear things that he's promised us. He's promised us that if we believe, we will have eternal life with him. And he has promised that he will never leave us or forsake us. But he has not promised us that we will not have suffering. In fact, he says the opposite. In this world, you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. So, 100%. I think that's, so true.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that one up there for me, Thomas.
Well,
I appreciate that.
I had a whole list of other little fun topics.
One of them had to do with eternal security. I know.
Oh, dang.
I didn't bring that one up today.
Or prosperity gospel could have hopped in there too.
Yeah, there's some interesting little things that'd be interesting to get to at some point. Like, I don't know if you guys talked about the, Egyptians hating shepherds at the end of this passage.
We're not there yet. We didn't get to,
but
go take Goshen.
Yeah, it's kind of round.
Yeah. He's like, listen, tell them, make sure you tell them that you're shepherds and you have been your whole life. You want Goshen. Yeah. It's Joseph's little insight into the story there.
It's very bizarre. But before we wrap up, do you guys have any takeaways or anything you'd like to close with?
No, I think I'm good, Thomas. Thanks.
Christy?
Yeah, just the whole, we can be more faith-filled if we just remember that he is faithful.
Amen.
It is a good one.
Amen.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you for checking out this video. If you've enjoyed it, do hit the like button. Drop a comment down below. We want to hear from you guys. Make sure to check out the website. Every piece of information that we have about our church is on there. So please do check that out. We want to hear from you. And if you are looking for home church and you're in the tri-state area of where we are, Kentucky area, please do come and join us. We want to see you here. So thanks for checking out this video, and we'll see you in the next one.